So I could actually stop my presentation now and just say Vancouver is exactly the same as Toronto, but just smaller. Because that presentation you just heard from Sean really captures all of the challenges and all of the things that we are doing in Vancouver, but just on a much smaller scale. So I'm Abby Bonham, I'm the Managing Director of Homelessness Services and Affordable Housing Programs at the City of Vancouver. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit, I will talk to you about what we're doing in Vancouver in terms of mixed income housing and mixed income communities. I'm just going to, here we go. So before we start, I'm also going to acknowledge that at the City, we live as a city, we live and work on land that is unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we are very grateful for the stewardship and leadership that they have shown to us over many years, and we want to respect that relationship more moving forward, and I'll talk a bit about how we're doing that. So to start, before we look forward, I kind of want to look backwards a little bit. Vancouver has changed significantly over the last 150 years. And the mix of people that live in our city, the diversity we see in our city has changed significantly. We're not the same city we were 100 years ago, this picture on the left. We're not even the same city we were in Expo 86. We're significantly different now in terms of the challenges and the people. And it's important, I think, to understand how quickly that change is happening and how intentional we need to be around policy or directions in order to not end up with a city that no one can afford to live in, that no one wants to live in, and that is kind of rich and dull, basically. So we don't want that. So this is a picture of our city council in 1886. Bunch of prestigious white dudes, basically. And in terms of what that means for diversity, so they were, running a city council in a community which was largely Indigenous, First Nations, and yet these are the people running the show. So that says a lot about where we came from in terms of diversity. We're very proud of who we are now as a city, but we have this history and this kind of systemic issues that have begun right from the beginning when we started as a city. This is who we are now. This is our city council right now. So we've made some progress around diversity. You can see 9 women, 3 men. So we have a women-forward council. Still not doing that well with regard to a racial mix, though. So we're still pretty white and not really reflective of our community. So in terms of diversity, I'm going to talk about affordability and income, but just to acknowledge that there's more to diversity than just income. We're basically a city of renters and have been probably forever. There's a few census periods on that, and I'm sure David will talk about a lot more housing data in relation to rental. But we're a city of renters, pretty consistent at over 50% of the population, unusual for a city. I don't think there's any other city apart from Montreal maybe that has so many renters living in it. And the reason for that is it's the only way to stay in the city. Home ownership has been out of reach for the majority of our families and households for many, many years. And if you want to stay and make your life in Vancouver, then rental is the only way to do it. In terms of other consistent data points, the number of households who are spending too much on housing has been pretty consistent and pretty high over several census periods. What that tells me is that over probably multiple generations, people in Vancouver have been making significant trade-offs about how they spend their money in order to stay in the city. So they're spending too much on housing, which means they don't have enough for childcare, they don't have enough for food, they don't have enough for transportation, to buy clothes, all of the other things which are important in terms of your life. And that's been pretty consistent over several periods. In terms of that mix, where those people are, you can see they're over-concentrated in our downtown core and our downtown east side. But interestingly, there are several pockets around the city where we also do see people spending too much of their income on housing. If I was to show you several other maps, that would also correlate to where most renters are living in the city as well. So again, it isn't just that people are spending too much of their income on housing, it's that renters are spending too much of their income on housing. Poverty is not spread out across our city. It's very focused again in the downtown core and the downtown east side. This is where our unsheltered individuals are living in the city right now. As you can see, we consider ourselves to be a diverse city. We're not really that diverse in terms of poverty. So what are we doing about it? Again, like as I said, we're pretty much on the same track as the City of Toronto. In 2017, we launched a new housing strategy as a result of speaking to thousands and thousands of people about the situation that they're facing in terms of the crisis. And they were pretty angry when we spoke to them. They were pretty furious about the fact that they were going to have to either move out of the city or that they were going to have to compromise, that they couldn't imagine a future where their children would be able to stay there. So again, this is why they tend to vote for politicians who put housing at the center of their platforms. Interestingly, they do that more at a municipal level, it seems, but the number one issue that we wanted to focus on was about retaining the diversity of income. So our housing strategy is all about that spread of incomes we want to keep in the city. And the reason why is because we're unique and diverse. It was something that people told us they loved about the city. They loved the fact that there were all different kinds of people there from all different kinds of backgrounds. That was one of the things they loved most about the city. They just couldn't necessarily see themselves being able to stay there for the long term. And when that group of people who can't see their future there is between the ages of 20 and 40, and they're the forming household, they're the children forming households, they're the skilled workforce, they're the key workers in the city, all of a sudden, and they can't afford to stay not just to buy a house, but they can't afford to rent a house with the right number of bedrooms, then all of a sudden, your economy is at risk. Because if you have those people living too far away or moving away from the city, basically it's going to constrain your ability to have a healthy economy. So all of a sudden you have a city which is basically facing an unhealthy, unsustainable future. So a key shift for us in Housing Vancouver, again, like Toronto, was to shift our housing production, our housing supply, away from condominium housing towards rental housing to meet the needs, not just of the people in greatest need, but the average person in Vancouver. Who are we trying to serve? So the other thing, and this goes back to the issue about diversity in our city, is that yes, if you have an income below $50,000 in Vancouver, you will struggle to find rental housing. Not only can you not afford it, but there's also a vacancy rate of less than 1%. So you'll have to compete for it in the market. So if you have children, a dog, a mental health issue, some other barrier facing you, you probably won't win that competition. So many people in our city are more marginalized around housing than others. So it isn't just about poverty, it's about all of the other kind of systemic issues and kind of intersecting identities that people bring with them when they're looking for housing. And so for us, thinking about that, we have to try and find a way to have a focus on those issues beyond just income if we want to create a future for ourselves that isn't kind of socially excluding. Luckily, I think affordable housing and the work of delivering affordable housing is a way to actually make sure that the future is socially inclusive. So I won't go into detail about this. This is what a spread of income might look like in terms of the future. It's a way for us to link income to a certain type of unit, which helps us to then focus in terms of planning approvals and new projects, make sure that what we're building and what we're incentivizing will potentially meet the needs of people or incomes. It's not an exact science, but it's a way to try and think about the concept to help staff working at the city make sure that the decisions they're making are meaningful. And it's all on our website and in our housing strategy. So the big shift is about not just supply. We didn't want to have an argument with the development community about whether supply was part of the solution or not, because it clearly is in any growing city. But it's about the right kind of supply. And so we spent a lot of time, a lot of focus in our strategy about trying to make sure that social housing, housing that's affordable to people or median incomes is a real focus. And I'll talk about some of the examples now. Before I do that, I just want to, again, put a little bit of context. What Sean was referring to earlier as the kind of key decades of delivery in Canada. For us, this is the big blobs in the middle. It's only within the last decade that we have even started to see an upturn in the delivery of rental housing. There is a reason why people can't find rental housing, is because we haven't been building it. And so we need to start to change that. But it's been a very intentional effort on our part to change what we were doing between 2000 to 2009, and to shift that to what you see in 2010 to 2017 on that chart. One of the challenges, again, that Sean mentioned was that we've actually been quite successful, are likely to be quite successful at delivering very expensive rental housing. New rental housing is expensive to construct, land is expensive to buy, and without subsidy from government, both municipal, provincial, and federal, it will not be affordable to those people with incomes under 30,000. So when we're looking at our housing strategy, basically if it's blue, it's good. If it's pink or red, it's not so good. So this is the gap that we see. We can probably build the right number of units, we just can't make them affordable enough. This is just a quick chart to show the new housing strategy kind of coincided with a massive increase in approvals in relation to social and supportive housing in 2017 and 2018. But those approvals probably were 5 years in the works to get to that point, and they're probably another 3 years away from delivery. So that supply line is a long one. It takes a long time. And part of my job at Vancouver is to think of ways to talk to our planning department about how we can reprioritize these projects above condominium housing in our city and make these go faster. I like this graph. This shows in 2018, we opened a record number of new affordable housing units, so purpose-built market rental, as well as social and supportive housing. And I hope that the supply chart that you just saw will start to turn into an occupancy chart in the future, but it takes a long time. In terms of distribution across the city, I think I'd give us a B+ for this. It's not bad. It could be better. So this is a split showing where all of those projects are across the city. Again, a little bit focused in the downtown core, but again, you can see it down the middle of the city as well, along some of our big transit corridors. But again, we can do more here. I think there's clearly parts of the city which are not taking their fair share of affordable housing. So some examples of what this looks like and tools to do it. So the use of inclusionary housing policy has been one major way that we have got new homes, inclusionary homes, delivered to us turnkey from a developer. So these communities will be mixed in the sense that 20% of the units will be affordable, and those units will be handed over to the city. We'll then get a nonprofit to lease them over a 60 or 99-year period. 80%, the rest of those, are all condominiums. And then within that 20%, you also then see a mix in the building of different rents. In this case, it's a housing co-op that's taken it on, so they would be a mix of housing charges rather than rents. But you see, this is a way to do mixed communities and mixed buildings. And obviously, also 50% of these are for families as well. This is a building, this was land owned by a nonprofit, and so the city supported this nonprofit to do 100% rental building, affordable, with both, I would say, rezoning policy and density, as well as grants invested into projects like this. And because of the rising costs of construction and the rising costs of land, we have, almost 2 weeks ago now, Council approved a new community housing incentive program, which effectively doubles the value of the grant that we would put into projects like this. But again, you can see a mix. This one is focused on women-led households. Another inclusionary housing project, again, 80% of this building is condominium, 20% of it is social housing that was handed over as an airspace parcel to the city, and we have a nonprofit who will manage that for the life of the building. Looking at the picture, you can't tell which 20% is social housing, and you will also be able to see within that range of rents within that structure as well. And lastly, slightly different tool, I do want to just highlight the difference between kind of inclusionary housing policy and density bonusing. This is something which some places might call rental-only zoning, or kind of incentivizing within the zoning structure for housing, for rental housing. And again, this would be 20% of the floor area for social housing, but without a rezoning. So council never saw this project. This went straight through our approval process without ever going to council, and was approved within about 9 months as a result of that. It just opened. This is the latest building to open. It's operated by an Indigenous-led housing provider and has 50% families. It's pretty small at 27 units, probably the smallest we would go for something like this. It gets a bit expensive to operate otherwise, but still an important addition in our West End community. And then before I get to the supportive housing, another key piece, which is really the backbone of what Sean was talking about, is the use of city land. So we have issued, probably over the last, 6-7 years, 13 different sites for housing, with encouraging nonprofit developers to come forward. And we anticipate this approach taking up or delivering about 50% of our target over the next 10 years. This particular partnership is with the Community Land Trust, so it's 7 sites, 1,000 homes, and it currently does have some provincial and federal money in it. Probably not enough, but it does have some to be celebrated. The first phase of the Community Land Trust project was 4 sites, and this was one of the first buildings to open in 2017. This is all for singles, so for key workers, and again, you see that spread of rents within that, from basically rents that are affordable to those people on income assistance through to kind of median incomes in Vancouver. Okay, so finally, supportive housing. So we've been using modular supportive housing in recent times to more quickly deploy housing for people who are homeless in our city. And we've been putting it on land, largely city-owned, or there is some private land, where there is a much more longer-term plan for that site to deliver permanent social housing. But in the interim, while everything goes through approvals, or there's some other factors that's going to create, not delays, but it's just going to take time to get there, we have deployed modular housing. And the great thing about it is not that it's temporary, it's that you can move it, actually. So we could move this to other sites and redeploy it in, say, 5 to 10 years. So through a partnership with the province, you can't really see you can see it, it's okay. Partnership with the provincial government, a rapid response to homelessness. In 18 months, we delivered 13 buildings on 10 sites. We actually have one more project that we approved yesterday, which is another 58 home building in another part of the city. And so with nonprofits who are managing these buildings on a housing first basis. So back to that equity discussion we were starting to have at the beginning. So who gets into housing and how we're able to impact systemic discrimination in our city is really important to us. And so this time around with supportive housing, we did some more in-depth evaluation about that. So who got into those 13 buildings? We focused significantly on women. So we had 3 of the buildings which were women-focused, mainly because women don't tend to show up in homelessness. They tend to be quite invisible, but we know they're a significant part of the population. And we also had a couple of buildings which were Indigenous-focused, or for people who are both Black or other persons of color, in order to try and reflect the fact that, again, those people were being greatly marginalized in our city, even around within homelessness. We also saw the majority of those units go direct to people who are either living in a shelter or who are living outside, but we did also transfer some people from very, very poor SRO accommodation into these buildings. And so before I wrap up the future, where do we go from here? So we started to understand this issue about systemic inequity in our city, and when it's combined with housing unaffordability is going to be one of the most powerful forces shaping our cities. And so thinking about things like how equity shows up in a poverty reduction strategy, an equity framework itself that's likely to be kind of race forward, thinking about those things further makes our work more complex, but it also is that part of that intentional thinking about who do you want to be as a city? Who do you want to be welcome here? What is the future going to be like in terms of the types of households that are able to live here? And all of that is going into the fact that we are about to launch a new citywide plan. So basically a land use plan, although I wouldn't say, don't tell anyone I said that, because it's not going to be just the land use plan. It's going to be the next iteration of what our city will look like in 30, 50 years. So this is a big moment for us and our council in launching an engagement program that is going to bring people together to not just think about affordability, but all those issues about equity. And again, who do you want to be in 30 years? So thank you.